Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Page Turners Plus. On our last episode, we were reflecting on Jacqueline Crooks' Fire Rush. As promised, we have Jacqueline Crook, and we'll be interviewing her today. Welcome, Jacqueline.
Hello there, everybody. Great to be here.
It's our pleasure to have you. So, I suppose we could start in a bit of the mechanics and aesthetic of the novel. So, Fire Rush is grounded in a reggae aesthetic. Creatively, what came to you first, dub music or the story? And in telling this story, were you consciously in conversation with other literary works grounded in the reggae aesthetic?
Yes, the sound definitely came to me before the story. I think dub reggae is such a powerful force. It's not just a music that you listen to, you feel it. And some 20, 30 years after having gone into those dance halls, the sound suddenly came back to me. And then when the sound came, so did the people that I used to know in that world. And so it was very much the sound that was the driving force for the story. Sound came before the words, and then the words came, and then the story. And yes, I think it's kind of not in conversation with exactly, but I did read Marlon James's brief history of seven killings, and that novel also is drawing on the reggae aesthetic, and the struggle for power and survival and corruption. So yeah, there were similar themes there.
And I just wanted to interject here with, because I did the audiobook, and I noticed the interludes with reggae were quite prominent. Did you have like a decision? Did you play a part in ensuring that that was part of the audiobook?
Yes, the publishers are really good. They consulted me because they recognized that they didn't know a lot about dub reggae. I don't think there's many books of fiction that have that kind of platform, that music. So they did give me permission to work with the musicians I wanted to create those dub licks and to put them in the certain scenes. So yeah, that was a really nice part to continue the creative journey with from the novel to the audiobook. Yeah.
Thank you, Kesua.
Yeah, we were saying in our discussion, it reminds us a lot of Anthony Joseph's musical kind of accompaniment for his book. I'm going to get the book title wrong now, but the
Frequency
novel.
of Magic.
Thank you, The Frequency of Magic. And yeah, definitely also listen to some of the audiobook. I did the weird thing of going between the audiobook and the novel, the text novel, so I kind of saw both. But onto my question, really. We had a conversation about kind of religious imagery in your novel. And we thought on the one hand that Yamie perhaps had an idealized vision of Jamaica that you kind of can find in the diaspora as people seek a kind of psychic escape. And so in some ways, Jamaica represented this kind of almost Zion kind of image. And then one of our friends who wasn't here today wondered if like London represented hell and Bristol purgatory, and then Jamaica was heaven. Are we on the right lines there, or are we doing our own thing?
Yeah, I think yes, definitely, because London, it's that subterranean world. It was about the politics of invisibility that migrant community experienced, and I was part of that migrant community. You had to hide yourselves to evade the police, the far right, and so it was a kind of non-living, really, in seeking out those dark subterranean spaces to feel safe. It was like purgatory of a kind. So yes, and then overground, you're having to come up to light, to the real world, to the mainstream world in Bristol, but surrounding you all these slave monuments and the sugar houses, reminding you of that history of enslavement. And yes, I think Jamaica becomes like the wider Caribbean, this kind of homecoming back to your ancestral land, and a site where you can fight more easily for your survival, like the Maroons, because they know the landscape and nature's kind of on their side. So yeah, those three parts do kind of resonate with that idea of purgatory. Yeah.
Would you say, Jacqueline, that in addition to a reggae aesthetic, the novel is grounded in a sort of reggae cosmology?
Definitely. I mean, I think for me, dub reggae, it was a sound before its time. It's both a sound of the future, it's futuristic, but it's a sound of the past. And where reggae comes from is the sound of a rebellion. Um, so yeah, it's ancestral, it's futuristic, it's ahead of its time. Dub reggae for me is almost beyond human creation. Those ghostly sounds, those voids and voids that kind of speak to us and that seem to conjure otherworldly spaces, that for me feel like out, the universe and outer space. Yeah, I think it definitely is grounded in a reggae cosmology, and that was deliberate.
I just wanted to sort of take you back to something you mentioned earlier in your answer to Keswa, where you spoke of the politics of invisibility. So the crypt appears to be more than just a dance hall. Bongo Nati uses it as a venue for introducing the youth to political thought and for organizing political responses to the community's challenges. You've been open about the fact that this novel is semi-autobiographical. Were the dance halls of your youth also centers for political action and education?
Yes, very much so. There was so much going on there because you remember these places were sites of communing as well. It wasn't just about dancing and music and letting loose. It was a chance for the community to share information. Where is there a big police presence that you might want to avoid? Where were the far right marching that week? So it was just sharing of valuable information to stay safe. It was encouraging others to march, march for our rights. It was also they would also recommend books by Stokely Carmichael, Angela Davis, about Black rights that were coming from America at that time. So lots of books were actually given, circulated. Here, read this, and you'd read it, and then you pass it on to someone else. So it's a real sharing of knowledge, all about fighting oppression, finding your voice, and coming together. That was a big part of those dance halls, I have to say, at that particular time.
And do you know if the situation is the same presently in the UK?
I don't think so, because by the time I was leaving that scene, that wasn't happening as much. It was very much that early period of the late 70s, when the migrants were still very new in the country, and everything was very, very toxic, and it was a hostile environment. So yeah, eight, 9 years later on, it wasn't so intense, but there was a lot of campaigning and coming together, and that kind of held us together. And I think that's where I've got lots of my kind of political leanings and my urge to work in the community setting and get involved in political activism was from those talks by the men. It was always the men who were doing the talking as well, typically Rastafarians, but not always. So it was a key site of activism and sharing knowledge, which I think not much is spoken of that.
Yeah, it's something that I really loved about the novel, actually, that it brings to life this other strand of activism that we rarely hear about. So I think in my day job, I'm a historian, and I kind of teach and research Black British histories. And there's a real kind of, I'm trying to avoid the word fetishization, but certainly elevation of particular forms of organizing, often those kind of recognizable groups such as the British Black Panthers, for example, things that look close to what we've seen or we've been educated to understand about American civil rights. Whereas we had in the UK, like you mentioned, this kind of really organic and particular form of organizing, and that was often came out of Caribbean communities, i.e. the Rastafaris, who were kind of political leadership, offered a vision of political leadership that we don't often talk about or certainly don't teach about yet. So thank you for that, in terms of kind of reminding us and giving us some stuff to work with. But on the same note, I think the question is here. I was really surprised that you didn't more explicitly talk about other things that were happening in the period. You cover the period that includes the Brixton Uprising, the Black People's Day of Action, the New Cross Fire, but also riots that are taking place across the country in 1981 in the UK. And was that a deliberate choice to hint at the need for action, that something was going to happen? You kind of hint at a kind of powder keg, what's the word, kind of feeling, I guess, among the youth, that there is a sense that something is amiss and something is awry. It might happen, but you don't actually address it.
Yeah, I think because that was my experience at the time. I was living in Southall, a very tiny, small town, in Greater London. It was almost felt as if it's outside of the centre of London. And what was felt within our tiny little community was the reverberation of the dub reggae music, similar to the reverberation of the dub music, where you felt there was something happening around the country, you know, because people would travel to clubs in Leeds, Bristol, and so you'd get a bit of communication lines that way, the youth here were kind of organising something, or they'd get getting angry about XYZ, someone was picked up by the police and brutalised, and so you sensed it. And I was trying to capture that sensory feeling, a bit like the roots of trees underground. You sense it, but you don't know for sure, but you know something's going to happen. That's how I felt. That's how I experienced it back in the 70s, on the day of the Southall riots. We knew that we were going to be marching, and because the far right was coming to our town, and we knew that other towns knew what was happening in our town and were already bracing themselves for what was going to come to their town. That was difficult to capture that. It's nothing tangible, something in the air, like the echo of dub reggae.
You definitely captured it, that sense of
Thank
something.
you.
Power is an important concern of the novel, but there's a flip side. Everybody all the main characters in the novel are marginalized people trying to grasp power. But we see some negative effects of that. There's a lot of misogyny, and in many respects, the attempts of these marginalized people to grasp power results in self-destruction or in harm to their families. Could you talk us through how you explore power and power dynamics in this novel?
Yeah, I think that was something that was really important to me to explore. I've experienced sexual violence in that community, and I think I wanted to and I also experienced a lot of support from men in that community and protection from men. So I wanted to ask the question, why is it that in these revolutions, women have this double jeopardy of having to fight the system and the structure? They're fighting Babylon, but they're also sometimes having to fight their men and defend themselves against their men. But I wanted to look at it from the man's perspective as well as the woman experiencing the violence. Through Manasseh, I tried to include his backstory of his mother, how he's abandoned emotionally and physically, and how he's fighting for power, how he has good intentions. He wants to fight for reparations for his community, but somehow his lack of development as a child means that he's not able to take that fight to the right place. It turns it inward into himself and then outward to those that are closest to him. So I really wanted that was my experience of myself and some other women in my friendship group at that point. So I wanted to explore that dynamic and to see what causes the men to be violent in that way. And also looking at Irving, the father figure, because he's also been violent towards his wife, and it's like this transmission of violence in communities that are experiencing such extreme levels of violence themselves. It's like, what do they do with it as they try to grapple for power?
I just wanted to pick up on that because when we had our reflections, we were sort of, I don't think we were, but we were exploring the idea of who should be devil and who should be saint. And we were wondering, like, who could we excuse? And I think particularly we were speaking about Manasseh and Irvin, and also Yamaye to an extent. And I think most of us gave Yamaye grace, although she may have been the author of a lot of her self-destruction. So in exploring that, did you see it clear-cut where Manasseh would be the devil no redemption. Everyone should hate him. And did you deliberately cast Yamaye as being someone who you could forgive and who is redeemable essentially?
No, I was actually trying to avoid that. You know, in Manasseh, I was hoping to my aim was to make him more nuanced. I wanted to show he's attractive, he's charismatic, he's got leadership skills. He's got these two men follow him, and he's trying to educate himself. Goes to the library, he's reading. You know, he's creating a safe space for him and his men, and he actually does, I think, want to create a safe space for Yame, but that becomes distorted. The more he realizes that he's got power over her, then it becomes distorted. So I wanted to show perhaps that all of us, under the right situations, under extreme situations, and with poor early childhood experiences, could be like him. He's the dark side, and to Moose is the light. It's light. It's kind of Jungian, really, playing this like shadow side and light. But if we switch it, I'm trying to suggest that perhaps Moose could have been like Manasseh if he'd had the same experiences.
I appreciate that answer. Kesua?
Lol. That wasn't the conclusion we came to last week.
Speak for yourself, Kesua.
Say that again, Paula?
I said speak for yourself.
Okay. So what Paula's alluding to is that we had a very intense discussion about this. And Paula was the one that said, can't we find space? Isn't Manasseh redeemable? What if? And we had, and I was quite firm that like he was totally irredeemable. But it's really nice to have these conversations with authors, because then we can see that like, wow, you've clearly painted them in, like, the way that you explain it is you can see exactly what you've done in the novel. We just didn't read it well. We didn't all read it in the same way. And yeah, it makes perfect sense. We definitely felt like he was the devil incarnate. He was the worst character we'd ever seen ever, and we hated him.
I wanted that. I wanted us to periodically or hate him in those moments. Absolutely, we're meant to hate him in those moments where he's violated Yame, but also we need to. I think what I'm trying to say is that we need to look at everything in the person. We need to understand the behavior. Is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, no, that's fine. I mean, to be fair, we did. I don't want to underplay it. It was a very nuanced conversation as well, because the question of redemption was like, where's the redemption? Who gets redeemed? Blah blah blah. Things that we really did discuss. One of the things that we also said was, I think the reason why we thought Manasseh was irredeemable was because we weren't sure about his backstory. We were like, is he telling the truth or not? Like, because he could just be evil and it's part of his, you know? And so like, if it's not true and it's just another way to manipulate, then he really is the devil. But if it is true, then it makes sense. So I think that was why we weren't as sure, I think, as you were there.
Yeah. I think it's easy to write off, you know, Black men who you know, violent, whatever. But I think it's so important to take into account of history and the transmission of trauma and violence.
Absolutely. No, we was. I'm glad we had this conversation again, because we just came to a completely different conclusion last week. It's really nice to have your take on it. That is not a question. I'm just continuing the conversation. The question is really short. I really like the way that you named her home as the Tombstone Estate. Often we know that like housing estates that become sort of really impoverished or really difficult places to live for people have these really idiosyncratic names, to say the least, you know, the Paradise Estate or whatever. But you chose the title Tombstone Estate. Was that a deliberate kind of speaking back to those kind of odd namings that don't speak to what the place is really like?
Yeah, I was. The estate I lived on, it did have a cemetery, a huge cemetery that cut right through it, and the cemetery was better kept than the social housing estate. And so I wanted the name, a Tombstone Estate, to bring in that hardness of the living environment. I think living environments are so kind of important to how people are developed and their natures. What it's like planting seeds in the earth, isn't it? So yeah, those names, Tombstone Estate, it was very deliberate to conjure that image of that hard, solid, concrete tower blocks and all the rest. It was important to get the names right. They had to sound like the place, and I wanted readers to visualize, this huge cemetery running through it. Yeah.
On that same note, the housing estate is called Tombstone. There's a cemetery, which is its neighbor immediately beside the housing estate. And interestingly enough, the cemetery is called Resurrection, which is kind of optimistic. It's a cemetery, but it's kind of optimistic. And then the dance hall, where the young people's lives are centered around this dance hall, it's called the Crypt. Now we have our theories about why you've grown the story in images of death, but I'd like to hear from you why it is that death was such an important theme throughout the novel.
Yes, I mean, there are two responses. The first is quite prosaic, that you know, we did dance in the crypts, and many Caribbean dances were held in crypts, because I think there was something about the church at the time giving us refuge and saying, okay, you can't, there's other businesses won't let you hire spaces for your dances, but we will, you can hire our spaces. And that was all they would let us have with the crypt. So it was it's grounded in reality. But the other part of it is, I think, as I've mentioned before, it is trying to, you know, we were dancing with crypts and tombs and dead people. We were living a kind of non-life. It felt like living like the dead sometimes. You know, my parents and grandparents from that community were just working. They almost stopped talking. They weren't allowed to speak patois. You know, they weren't. There was a hostile reception, and so they became silent. That's how I experienced it. So they were like the living dead, and I think I wanted to capture that in that, you know, the Tombstone estate, the crypts. Yeah, that's what it felt important to capture that.
I just wanted to pick up on something you just gave in your answer there, because when I was reading the novel, I kept thinking, you know, this is like almost an entire generation after the arrival of the first Windrush, first members of the Windrush generation, and this generation definitely seems a lot more radical compared to texts that you've read of the sort of rampant abuse that these original members of the Windrush generation faced, and some of them fought it off, some of them just sort of took it. So I was wondering if in your writing it was sort of a deliberate plan to demonstrate the heightening or escalation of that radical behavior, that sort of we're not going to take it as it is attitude in the children of these members of the Windrush generation.
Very much so, because, you know, our parents were like, just be quiet, just get on, we don't want any trouble, just do the work, and whatever happens to us, we've got to take it. They were terrified. But the next generation who were born in this country and go to a bunch of the schools, they've seen what other people were experiencing, and their experiences being very different to their own, they were not going to tolerate that. And there was this feeling of this building of rage, which I think rage is the central force, if not alongside the dub reggae, it's the central force that's driving this story. That was the feeling that we were all suppressing at that time. It was rage, but the rage, you can't contain it, can you, forever? It just builds and it builds and it builds until there is an explosion, hence the riots and hence the murder and everything else. But I did want to show that building of that fire.
I'm just going to kind of come back to this question of character. So you spoke really eloquently, if that's not condescending, it's not supposed to be, about Manasseh. And one of the things that we loved about this novel was the detail and the care that you gave to all of the secondary characters and even the third characters sort of levels. That there was a real sense that everybody had a backstory, everybody had a rationale, everybody was fully human, actually. And I guess what I'll pick up on one of them that I was particularly intrigued by, Crabman. And he's such a kind of, I think he must speak in two scenes, right? He's such a, on the one hand, peripheral character, and yet his movements are so central to the story. And I think my question is, because I don't want to give any spoilers to anybody that's watching that hasn't read the novel yet. Are you suggesting with characters like that, the kind of inherent tension with having communities of people who on the one hand try not to ask questions of each other because their lives are so probed and poked out the rest of the time, that the communities are therefore inherently vulnerable to outsiders with ill intentions.
Yes, it's that classic line that was rampant in our community: don't chat your business out the street, don't tell people your business. Everything had to be kept confidential. And yeah, there was that danger that came of not knowing, having vital information about certain people, not transmitting it. Yes, I think that was definitely a part of it. And there were people like that in the 70s who were, feeding back to the police. They were hired by them, undercover. But they had to be on the extreme margins. We were on the extreme margins, but they were even further away from that center. And I'm fascinated by people like that who don't belong anywhere. They're far off on the edges somewhere, and because of that, that extreme isolation makes them so dangerous. They belong to no community. They have no one to answer to. Yeah.
Isn't there, just to follow up though, wasn't his downfall that he did have a bit of a community, that he was recognizable to some people, and that's why, and that was kind of his undoing in some respects? Is it because you thought of him as such a marginal, or because he's painted as this super marginal character, but at the same time there's a place he belongs he thinks no one knows he belongs, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I think I was trying to show Mo that although that's where he originates from, he doesn't really belong there either, and that's why he's chosen to become a police grass, because it enables him to flit from place to place, because that's his comfort zone. He doesn't really have a true community. Even that place where he's originally come from, he's not there often, and he has no real social ties there that are kind of honest and meaningful. He is on the extreme. He is extremely isolated. Yeah.
The crypt, it's a sanctuary from Babylon for the youth, but it's also a place of danger for women. Similarly, the safe house is a sanctuary for Yamaye, but it's certainly a torture chamber, I think, more so than it is a safe house. And even the relationship between Yamaye and Asase, even though Yamaye finds some support, because Asase has her ways, but she is supportive sometimes. So even that is simultaneously comforting and unsafe. So you play with that. It seems to me in the novel a lot that comforting places can also be unsafe places. And I was wondering, what was that intentional, and why you wanted to explore that, if it was intentional?
Yes, it was very intentional. Again, just going to my experiences as a child and young woman, my house sometimes was not safe for me, depending on who was in it. And that was my experience within the dance hall. It was the same thing. Sometimes, a lot of the times, the dance hall was really safe and people were protective. But if someone like Crabman came into that environment, then you were in danger, you were at risk, and everything changed like that. And similarly, in other, like on the street, you could be walking down the road and you're safe, and then a police van, the Marai van, drives up, and suddenly everything changes. And I haven't experienced that. I wanted to try and describe that feeling where somewhere that feels safe one minute and you're comfortable becomes, in the flick of a switch, dangerous. And I wanted to show how unsettling that is, and how unsettling it is to go from that feeling of, oh, you're okay, to suddenly you're going to have to fight for yourself. You're going to have to think very quickly and find a way out. I wanted to get that onto the page and to show, because that's life, isn't it? Things can change very quickly. In an instant, you're in a completely different position.
And in terms of exploring the whole concept of Babylon, because Yami was quite focused on chanting down Babylon very often in the novel, but she existed within the belly of the beast itself. What I would call the belly of the beast for the children of Jamaican migrants, because Jamaica was ultimately colonized by the British. So when she has this idealized vision of Jamaica, Is it because she sees it as that escape from Babylon, where she exists, she lives in the belly of the beast, and she sees Jamaica as this idealized place that would bring her peace, that would get her away from the oppression?
Yes, it is exactly that. You know, that's her links to her ancestors, is possibly the link to her mother. And the mother figure here is the island. It is its nature, where the women here are searching for a safe site for mind and body, and so the maternal figure is that. So yes, it becomes this idealized place. But also she's heard stories of Queen Nanny and the Maroons and this revolutionary woman fighter, and that's driving the fight within her. She's having to think, oh, actually, maybe I can fight for myself, and maybe that's the place that I'm going to get my strength. It's almost as if that abeng horn from those revolutionaries are calling her. So yes, I'm trying to show that sound, the ancestral sound continues. It still reverberates, just like dub reggae. And if perhaps Yamai's thinking if she's tuning in, then she's going to get back to where she's meant to be, and where she's meant to be is home as far as she's concerned.
And
I love this.
on a, oh, sorry, I was just gonna interject here on like a slightly geeky or nerdy note, like in terms of the elements. Fire Rush would essentially be the opposite of Wind Rush, and I suppose that's her attraction in the opposite direction that the Wind Rush ship MV Wind Rush went. I don't know if I'm reading too much into it or I'm reaching, but I just saw it that way. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, fire is the element. It's the element of the rage. It's the element of dub reggae music. Yeah, it's the opposite of fire, right? I mean, I am very thinking about the elements when I'm writing my stories and novels.
Yeah, I just love this idea of Jamaica being her mother and that representing the maternal figure. I hadn't read it that way at all, but it makes perfect sense. It's quite a beautiful kind of image as a mother. I wanted to pick up on this idea of the women in the novel actually, because I think I was particularly surprised. It starts off this kind of story of these three girls and their raving days, and they're young and they're gorgeous and they're happy in different ways, you know, and they've got this sanctuary, as we've kind of talked about. But actually that friendship isn't what this isn't waiting to exhale. You know, this isn't going to be this story of female friendship that we kind of imagine we're being drawn into at the beginning. And it's really clever. I think it's very, one of the things we talked about is this novel has so many layers and themes, and we've kind of touched on them a few in this conversation, and we touched on those last week. There's a lot going on, but this isn't, I don't think, a tale of sisterhood in the way that we classically imagine that to be. Yet it is a fiercely feminist story, right? There's a woman at the center of it, and it's very much about her becoming. It's got this kind of, I like to think of it as the kind of Their Eyes Are Watching God energy, where like she's gonna have this fantastic love story, but her story goes beyond that. You know, and actually the ending is about as feminist an ending as I could have ever imagined. I don't have much imagination, but that was incredible. That she would kind of use the source of her oppression as the source of her own liberation to, you know, to not have any spoilers is and it's so wonderfully done as well. I think it might be the scene I've been waiting for my whole life. But this is just all commentary. It's not a question, but I guess there is a little bit of a question. How did you come up with that? How did you come up with this idea how did you manage to maintain the kind of strong strengths of this is about a woman and her own liberation, her own searching for herself and freedom without kind of sticking to kind of quite a classic, well-loved trope of girls that grow together and hang out together in difficult circumstances? Because you could have written that novel, but you were like, nah.
I think I'm kind of decolonizing what literature is and can be. You know, literary works, you don't have too many things going on. Hold on, I'm Jamaican. We're going to throw it all in. Bring on the bangarang, right? That's, to me, I'm trying to be honest about who I am. I'm Jamaican. I'm going to bust style on the page. I'm not going to hold back. I'm going to throw everything into the pot. But also, I'm writing about the Black Sound Revolution, and there was so much happening. I wanted to get as much of it in because it's all interconnected, you know. But the sisterhood, I think I'm trying to be honest here. The relationships, how can these women have a loving relationship that is sustained across time when they've come from these histories of with violence and broken families, and you know, it's they don't know how to love. They haven't seen love themselves. They desperately want to love each other, but it's the love is sustained in different ways. I'm trying to show. So although the sistering break down, you can still hopefully feel they still love each other, but it's just they just cannot make it work. And just as the mother figure is cut off, that's what's happened to a lot of the Windrush generation. The mother figure was cut away. They came over here to work and left the children back home, joined later. The maternal figure was somehow always lost, but there is still love somehow in the distance, is what I'm trying to show. So yeah, I'm challenging what is good literature and what can you do and what can't you do. But I'm trying to be honest about these relationships of the black sistren.
Isn't it possible though? Because I think what you do as well is that it is the sistren that saves her, but it's not the sistren she expects. It isn't the other girls from the estate. It's when she returns to Jamaica, when she meets other women, and they're not equals in the same way. The power dynamics are also off, but there's a healing in those women that isn't in her other sisters in London. That means she's able to engage with them differently, and she's able to be free differently, or she's able to be free at all.
Yeah, because these women are
about sisterhood in the end.
Yeah, these women are on the island, so they're closely linked to the mother. They've got the resources of Mother Nature. They have more to help that love to be sustained and to help the relationship to sustain.
So I think you do say all power to the sisterhood, because she couldn't have done that on her own, right? The sisterhood is there. It's just not what we're expecting. I think that's the credit to you for doing it that way, I think.
And just to plug again, another icon of the sisterhood, I thought Charmaine, as much as Charmaine was disempowered, Charmaine did help Yami to empower herself. That was my reading anyway. Having gone through that horror, she was able to navigate. She was able to help Yami see how she could navigate that very horrible situation. But staying with that horrible situation that Yami found herself in, it seems, and staying also with your commitment to honesty in this novel, it seems that you were very intentional in showing that Yamaye saw the red flags when it came to Manasseh, but she dismissed them. She second guessed herself because, well, also Manasseh was very clever at manipulating her. So he played cat and mouse very often with her. So it was easy in those circumstances for her to second guess herself. What I wondered was whether you wanted to make a particular point about second guessing your instinctive responses.
Yes, I think what I was trying to show was that Yame has grown up in an environment where she's not at all at ease with Irving. You know, there's this kind of subliminal threat always there as an undercurrent because he was violent, and as a child there's a memory of that somewhere, so she's not at her ease with him. There is a kind of violence that he's almost as if he could crack at any time, Irving. So when she meets Manasseh, it's very familiar to her, and I'm trying to show that often violence is sometimes about it's what we're familiar with, then that's what attracts us, even though so the danger signs are kind of get pushed down because we draw this is what I know. So I was trying to show that connection between Manasseh and Irving. The safe house is very much like the house she lives in with her father, which isn't safe in one way.
Yeah, and there is the old adage that you marry your father, and men marry their mothers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask. This is also a slightly political question. You named one of the novel's victims of police violence, Barry Floyd.
Mm-hmm.
Was that a nod to George Floyd? And if so, did you mean to tie in police brutality against Black people in Britain with police brutality against Black people in the United States? or did you just mean to honor George Floyd's memory?
So I started writing this novel like it's 18 years ago now. So I originally had a list of the names of the Black and Asian men that had been killed by police in that period. But I thought long and hard about it when I came to the final edits in 2020, 21, I can't remember now exactly. And I thought, no, I can't use the real names because it felt disrespectful. And so I changed the names and I just used George Floyd because I knew someone called Floyd, I knew someone called George, and I just put those together. So it was completely coincidence that then the George Floyd was murdered. I think maybe like 8-9 months after those names were used and had been changed from their original names. I think it was on the last edits with the publisher just before finalizing the book that George Floyd was murdered. So it was a complete coincidence, and I kind of like felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, and I realized that name was the same. And also it was kind of shocking to me to think, wow, I was writing about things that happened all the way back then. It's still so happening and so blatantly. Yeah.
All right, Kessu, we have time for one more question.
Oh Lord, the pressure. Maybe I could. Okay. No. I really had a thought I was going to ask you. We really enjoyed this novel as a collective. It was like we could talk about it for a long time. But instead of talking about this novel, I'll ask about the characters. Is there any possibility that we'll get to see them again? Do you have any? Can you tell us a little bit about any future projects?
That's really interesting. I think the only time these characters will come back again is if they come back on screen. For me, I think these characters are finished. I don't really want to explore that. I'm actually working on another novel and immersed with other characters and other issues around the Black community. So no, for me. But if there was going to be a film or a series made, then I would obviously hope to be consulted on the characters, and maybe there would be some development of them somewhere if it was a series. But for me as an author, no, I think it's good better to leave people wanting more than give them too much, and I don't feel the energy to take their stories. I also really like the way it ends with Yame, and I feel no, I'm really happy with that ending.
All right. Thank you very much, Jacqueline. It was our pleasure to interview. It was our pleasure to read your novel and to reflect on it as well in our last episode. For our readers and for our viewers, we'll be reflecting on Astrid Romer's Off-White in our next episode. But before we leave you, we have a reading by Jacqueline Crooks. Thank you for joining us.
A policeman takes us downstairs into a centralized mortuary in the large basement area. We go into a small room. Niall's arm is around my shoulders, shaking. The place smells of disinfectant, rotting fruit. His body on the table, a mahogany sculpture, white mist cloth laid over his body. I lift the sheet, step beneath the beams of fluorescent light. His eyes, nose and mouth are floating on the darkened dead tissue of his face. An almost smile that says, "Emancipate." I touch the tip of his nose. I'm breathing too fast. It's too late to warn him about the risks of a successful Black man walking the streets, springing up on his toes, swinging his arms to show he's free. It's too late to warn him about the risks of dry season riots, batons, beatings, police vans crawling like bugs, metallic, iridescent, sucking the sap out of nighttime trees. It's too late to sing him my roots rock rebellion songs. All I know of rainforests, he's told me everything about his earth riddim ancestry. Abeng horn blaring inside my head, on and on and on. Heat in my chest and gut, a repossession, a hot howl that can't be human. blackout.